Welcome to Consider the Sources, Architectural Collections. I'm Linda Randolphe. We are live from the Benjamin Powell House to talk about architecture at Colonial Williamsburg. We'll get to your questions very soon, so please post them in the comments. Before we do that, let's meet our guests. Dani Jaworski, Manager of Architectural Collections, and Chris Swan, Senior Conservator of Furniture. Dani, please tell us about your role as manager of this collection.
As manager, I'm in charge of looking out for the maintenance of all the buildings that we have, over 600 buildings that we have in the historic area, but also the architectural fragments, of which we have over 18,000, and then the architectural models, which we have about 50 of currently in the collection.
That's quite a lot to be responsible for.
Yes, it is.
So Chris, tell us about your part in safeguarding the wooden artifacts of this collection.
Yeah, the wooden artifacts comprises a large grouping of the collections here, including furniture, architectural collections, musical instruments, composite objects, sculpture, folk art, a wide range of things. And it may involve analysis, treatments, preventive care, and also a wide range of activities for preservation.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris and Dani, for telling us about your work with architectural collections. Now, let's take a moment to learn more about what architecture as a collection is here at Colonial Williamsburg.
My name is Dani Jaworski, and I'm the manager of the architectural collections here at Colonial Williamsburg. And what that entails is it's the buildings, the fragments, the models. It also incorporates paint samples, hardware, anything associated with buildings in the historic area or in the region. We have over 600 buildings, and so that means that then we have a lot of objects from them or objects related to them. When we say fragments, it could be mantles that have come out, it could be doors, it could be anything like that that tell us the history of the buildings themselves. And then of course the buildings, which people see first when they come to Colonial Williamsburg, also now house other collections that we have here. They not only represent themselves, but they represent what was going on inside of them, the people that lived in them and what they used, furniture, how they like to decorate, paintings, anything like that for historic interiors. I am sitting in our architectural collection storage area here for Colonial Williamsburg. We have lots of shelves just filled with any kind of fragment from any of our buildings or buildings in the surrounding area. We also have pieces from England, English manor houses, and we have storage for oversized pieces all the way down into the little teeny tiny little specks of paint. When we change colors of our buildings in the historic area, we base them off of these samples that we have. What I really love about our architectural collection is that it ranges from the late 17th century basically all the way up into the 1960s. We have a little scuttle door from the Nelson Galt House, and it dates to the 1690s. And then we have benches from some of our taverns that are from the 1950s when they were reconstructed, and it all tells our history from the very beginning to today. I'm very excited that we're going to be having an exhibit opening on April 30th. It's called Restoring Williamsburg, and it's going to have some of our best pieces to showcase the built environment that was here in the 18th century and then up into the 19th century. And it's got amazing pieces in it. I mean, our earliest piece, Scuttle Door from the Nelson Galt House in the 1690s. We have the circa 1715 weather vane and finial from the magazine. We have doors that represent different styles and different uses throughout the historic area, including a really unique kitchen door from the Thomas Everard site, which we had to have conservation work done on, which was very exciting because we don't normally get to do conservation work on our pieces, but when they go on exhibit, we are able to. And that was very exciting to get the work done on that and get that exhibited. We have the only surviving overmantel that we know of from the late 18th century that was in a Williamsburg house. And we even have charred pieces from our original buildings that still show that even though something was ruined, we can still use it. We even have things from rats' nests from our various buildings, just to show how this is what people had in the buildings at the time. And so it's just like a little snapshot of life within the buildings. The purpose of having a collection like this is to show us different styles that were here and that were used. So if anybody wanted to come study and say, what did trim look like in this building in case it doesn't still survive in there, or a building that's no longer here, what were some of its interior trim designs, what did they look like? And they can come here and they can look at it and get the design elements from it. So these pieces aren't just something to look at, they're something to study and tell us about design elements in the built environment that was here and in the surrounding areas in the 18th century and in the 19th century. At the start of the restoration, they determined that 88 buildings in the historic area were what they like to call original, and that was that they were on original foundations. Not everything you saw above ground was original, but some of them did retain interior elements and some of them even exterior siding or brickwork that survived. So 88 of those did. There were still hundreds of other buildings, and by looking at things like the Frenchman's map and period maps, they were able to kind of determine what was here that shouldn't be here anymore, and then they could reconstruct what should be here based on those maps. And they would take elements or fragments from the surviving buildings, and they would copy them and then reconstruct these other buildings based on the dates that they would have been constructed. And so you would take an original building, find another building that was no longer here, and reconstruct it to match a period building, one that was built at the same time that it was. The restoration of Williamsburg continues today. It wasn't just something that happened from the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, but even as early as 2017, when we took the Raleigh Tavern, which had been reconstructed in 1930, and we put a porch on it in 2017 that we know was there. It was found archaeologically. We know what it looked like based on its footprint, but then also on the Frenchman's map, it shows a porch along there. So we were able to then put that all together. And so we restored the building to more like what it would have looked like in the 18th century when it was being used pre-revolutionary period. It's actually a very exciting time right now for people to visit Colonial Williamsburg, not only to see our wonderful buildings, but in the very near future to see an exhibit of our restored pieces, but then also to go online and at our Colonial Williamsburg website, you can take a virtual tour of this storage area and see more and learn more about the pieces in our collection.
Dani and Chris are ready to answer your questions, so go ahead and post them in the comments. Dani, can you tell us why Colonial Williamsburg collects fragments from its buildings in the historic area?
Yes, since the start of the restoration in the 20s, they were collecting pieces from buildings so that when they were going to either restore them or reconstruct them, they had actual 18th century elements to copy. So they were using them to remake, whether it be trim work, or it could even be floorboards, it could be anything like that. So we were lucky because architectural preservation wasn't really a thing then. So just the fact that they thought about saving pieces and copying them and studying them was just remarkable, and then the amount of pieces that they saved was incredible.
Now, when you're talking about fragments, can you give us an idea of what the range of sizes that we're talking about?
They can go anywhere from like the massive circular window from Bruton Parish Church, something that size, to large doors, all the way down to like little microscopic flecks of paint that we can then analyze and determine 18th century paint colors that were here in the historic area.
That's quite a range. All right, thank you, Dani. And now let's answer some questions from our audience. Our first viewer would like to know, what exactly is the Frenchman's map?
Well, the Frenchman's map is a map that it's in the Swan Library at William and Mary, and it's dated May 11th, 1782, and it was done by an unknown Frenchman that is believed to have been here with Rochambeau's army, and it's believed to be a billeting map or lodging type of map just to show where the French might have been after the Battle of Yorktown.
So why is that so helpful for you today?
Well, what's helpful for us is at the start of the restoration and even today, they looked at that to determine where buildings were in the historic area, and then from the start of the restoration to even now, we do archaeological work. We find foundations at locations where we see buildings on the map. And from basically the 20s to today, we've reconstructed buildings where we can either see something on the Frenchman's map or where it's led us to an area and we found something there, some sort of building, and then tried to either reconstruct it or at least acknowledge that something was there.
That's a very helpful resource. Another viewer wants to know, what buildings are you working on now?
Currently, we're working on the Bray School, which was the school for the enslaved and free black children that we're working on. This particular building, the school was in it from 1760 to 1764. And so the building has just come into Colonial Williamsburg's possession from the College of William and Mary, or from William and Mary. And what we're doing is we are deconstructing the interior, taking down modern plaster and everything, and looking for what the building actually looked like when it was constructed. And we're actually finding exactly what it looked like. We're finding reused pieces and then pieces still in place to show us exactly what it looked like. And we're also working on things like what was the George Reed House, which is now going to be called the Catherine Orr House, because in studying an overmantel painting that is in our paintings collection, it led us to studying the building, and we've now found through dendrochronology, tree ring dating, and then just through research that the building that is here is actually earlier than George Reed's time, and actually is to the time of Hugh Orr, who was a blacksmith, and his wife, Catherine Orr, and she was the one who was living in it during the time of the Revolution, so it's now going to be renamed the Catherine Orr House. And what's interesting is Hugh Orr, and then after his death, Catherine Orr, actually sent some of their enslaved kids to the Bray School, so there's a nice little connection there.
For sure. Another viewer would like to know whether you see signs of reuse or recycling in the buildings that you study.
And that's a great question, and yes, we do. Back in the day, you didn't have Home Depot, you didn't have Lowe's, you didn't have any place to go when you wanted to either fix something or build something new. What you did was you either reused what you had in your building, or you went out and found something just laying around. And so reuse was very, very common. And so almost every time we go in and remove modern plaster and look, we can find reused framing elements, flooring, I mean, even some roofing aspects also. So yeah, it was very, very common.
Very interesting. Well, Catherine wants to know what building in the collection has the most saved fragments?
There are a few. We have quite a few from the Randolph House. We have quite a few from Wythe, Timpson House. All of these are original buildings in the historic area. And then what's almost even more exciting are the smaller collections. The buildings that we don't have a lot from, because that makes those fragments that much more valuable to us. And also from the buildings that we know had been heavily restored, having these just a few 18th century pieces of trim or something like that that were actually in the house to begin with, are really all we have left to look at. So we have a lot from some buildings, but I really enjoy the ones that we only have a few pieces from that tell us the story of that building.
Excellent. Another question from a viewer is, how are things done differently in these days than when the restoration first started?
We're very lucky here. When the restoration started, they had the idea to save architectural pieces and elements and to copy, and then not only did they copy them, but then they thought about saving them for today. And so that's how the collection even began. I mean, the collection began with the Ludlow Paradise House, because buildings are part of our collection, and that was actually the first object that Rockefeller had purchased in 1926. So that basically started, they didn't realize it, but started the architectural collection. And then all the other pieces that they saved over the years from the buildings or from buildings in the Chesapeake region that they went out and got to study when they were reconstructing buildings here or restoring them, they had the thought to keep them. And then today, what we can do with that is we have better ways to study things. We have better analytical tools. Like Chris can do in conservation, they have ways of determining woods, types of woods, and how the paint was made. And so today, we're just building on what they were doing and learning more and more about the buildings. We don't know everything. We probably never will know everything because technology will get better. But I mean, it's just improved technology as it continues on. We'll just learn more and more.
And there's also, if I can add, there's a greater level of documentation now that we pursue and that we have the advantage of building on. The collective knowledge of the study of these buildings here in Williamsburg and in a lot of other early 18th century sites around in the country, that we have the benefit of knowing what we're looking at today based on what we know has been found and studied. So there's a greater level of documentation, I think, now than there was at the beginning of the restoration.
So what kind of documentation is helpful for you?
For conservation especially, we have a lot of advanced technologies, for example, imaging technologies, ground penetrating radar and X-radiography, infrared and ultraviolet and other false color rendering types of imaging that enable us to sort of see into the surfaces and to see construction that gives us more insight. but also just the general level of written documentation and the extensiveness to which we will record the information, both that we find and that we process ourselves. So there's a continuing record there.
All right. Well, Jacqueline would like to know, because she's assuming that you're working along with the archaeology team, and will you be doing reconstruction at the school?
Reconstruct, well, what we're going to be doing is where the Bray School currently is located, it will not stay there. It will be moving to a new location on Francis Street near where the First Baptist Church site is currently, where you can go see the archaeological dig. And they will do, they have to do investigations there before we can move over. We do know in studying the Bray School where it is today that it did have some sort of basement to it. So they're going to have to really check the site before we move it over there, because we do plan most likely in putting one back in. So yeah, we work very closely with archaeology on this project.
Excellent. Another viewer wants to know, how are the artifacts in the collection acquired?
A majority of our fragments in the collection are from historic area buildings. And again, they were first collected in the 20s, and they even come in today if we have to do anything with the modern upgrades in buildings, and an 18th century, say a floorboard has to be removed in order to work on pipes or anything like that. We bring it into the collection. We don't just toss it if they can't work around it. And so things are still coming in today, but a majority have just been collected over the last, almost 100 years. And so, and it can be anything. It can be, again, floorboards, doors, window, whatever.
Yeah, it's fascinating when you think that the discoveries here at Colonial Williamsburg have been going on for decades, and you're still finding new things. And
restoration never ends.
Yeah, excellent. All right. So our next question is, how do you decide what fragments are saved?
Well, if it's early, if it's 18th century or if it's 19th century and it has to come out, then we save it. I mean, that's part of the history of the buildings. If they hadn't been saved, if they hadn't started saving them again in the 20s and 30s, we would have lost a lot of information. And so for the future, saving even anything from the 19th century will still tell them a lot long after we're all not here. And so it's just important. So anything that's early or original to the buildings, we hold on to.
All right. So how do you decide, we've talked about what fragments are saved, but what is the most unusual story you recall about a building fragment?
Well, like I said, the overmantel painting that was from what's now the Orr House was fascinating, and that's a case where we can work with another curator and the conservators. I mean, we had to work with Chris also. In order to exhibit it, we had to have him replicate a mantle for us, for it to go in, to show it. And the interesting story was that it had been to George Reed's time. And then again, in studying, no, it's actually earlier, but we still don't know who painted it. We don't know exactly when it went in. So it's the story that keeps on going. We still don't know. We don't have an answer to that story yet. But that's a very exciting one. And again, it led us to restudying a building, and we're learning now that that building's not what we thought. So it's just the whole story of an original building that we thought we knew everything about is completely changing.
It's amazing how the stories keep evolving. Another question is, what are some of the most recent items to be added to the collection?
Well, we've added late 17th, possibly, could be early 18th century casement window from Massachusetts. And the reason why we went out and got that is because we know that we had casement windows here in the 17th century and even into the 18th century here in Williamsburg. You don't see them today, but we know we had them. You see replicated ones like in the coffee house. In the basement, you see the casement windows, and those were based off of lead and the little glass pieces that were found archaeologically on the site. So we know that they had those windows there. And it's very rare that any survive. And so this one that was from Massachusetts is just a perfect visual representation of the type of casement windows that we know were made and actually used here in Williamsburg in the late 17th and early 18th century. So that was a really special thing to have come into the collection.
It sounds like it. Well, Royan wants to know, how much cooperation and exchange of information is there between Colonial Williamsburg and other historical preservation museums?
Well, in terms of collections, a lot. I mean, we all like to share. That's the beauty of being able to have digital collections, is we can see each other's objects, we can talk about them, and we can reach out and say, hey, we see on your site that you have something similar, or we think we found something similar to that, and then we can just share information about them. And really, that's the whole purpose. That's the purpose of the architectural collection, is so that we can learn about other buildings, and then people can learn about what we have here and just share that information of our common built histories.
But I would imagine that the size and the breadth of the collection that we have here makes us a valuable resource for other institutions.
Yeah, it is very much, and there's a very strong tradition of museums lending and borrowing from each other as well, direct objects exchange. Not so much in the architectural world, although that does happen, for example, with a Minokan staircase, which is an extremely rare fragment, a staircase actually intact, that we were able to work on. But in the museum world in general, it's very common to loan and borrow objects back and forth for those regional stories when they occur, and so that's a very useful thing.
Excellent. Matt would like to know, do you ever think there will be a digital printer to create reproductions? Interesting.
There is, and in fact, we have already employed that kind of technology to recreate things like an early English soldier's helmet from Jamestown from the 17th century. So that technology is somewhat useful in an interpretive way, not so much in the way of recreating parts to old objects. So we're still sort of investigating the use of that technology because of the stability of the kind of resin that's being used, and we want to make sure that the parts that we attach to an old object are going to survive and age well in relation to those old materials. So it may have some use, but I think it's more of a reproduction tool where you want to interpret something that's lost, but that you have information about, that you can retell some of that story. So I think it already is being used, and maybe more so in the future.
Some very interesting questions from our viewers. Well, thank you for those questions. And let's take a moment now to learn more about how the collection is cared for. Remember, please continue to post your questions in the comments.
My name is Chris Swan, and I'm furniture conservator and wood and artifacts conservator. I work in a purpose-built laboratory as opposed to on-site in support of building the collection and preserving the collections of all types. One of the most common questions we get from our public, the difference between conservation and restoration, and essentially conservation is the umbrella term that covers a lot of the various aspects of preserving cultural objects and materials. It might include restoration, which is the reconstructing of something or the putting back together, the fixing, that aspect of it. But it usually includes a lot more of the history of ownership, what we call provenance. It might include the material makeup, the analysis of what those materials are, how they go together, the historic technology, the place of origin and the time of origin, and we'll look very closely at stylistic evaluations. The restorative or restoration part of it is what we call the treatment part, and that is the actual hands-on repair and reconstruction part of it. But we will also do careful documentation of what it is we've learned and what we find, and what we've done to the object, if anything. Preventative work is also included in the larger scheme of what we consider conservation. So it's an important step in thinking about future ideas and measures that we can take that will affect the longer term preservation of an object or a collection. So we might consider storage conditions, ways that the future handlers and professionals might handle an object, how they might move it, keeping light levels low, keeping pests out of collections. All those things are preventive. And so that's one side of conservation as opposed to the interventive side when things are physically apart or need reconstructing. Architectural projects are established when the architectural collections that we're considering have been removed from the building. And these include window sashes and doors, hinge elements, parts to a building that may be disassociated now that are part of the collection. They get their own number and they're treated like any other object in our collection. we'll do a study and analysis of the object and then undertake a treatment if necessary, and then work with the museum's team for installation. For one example, we treated a dairy louver fragment from an 18th century dairy that no longer survives. There are dairies in the historic area in Colonial Williamsburg today that are partly based on a fragment like this one that we treated. The fragment came in two parts. The treatment required us to put those two parts back together. So that's a minor treatment where we're carefully re-gluing those bits and filling in the missing elements to make that one whole fragment that is readable or more easily interpreted. And we would be very careful not to remove original material, using reversible glues and adhesives and that kind of thing, and that's standard practice for conservation. Another example is a charred panel from the 1930s fire at Bassett Hall. This is an important time historically because the Rockefellers, of course, had just bought Bassett Hall in 1926. And then there was the devastating fire before they had moved in 1930, in which much of the upstairs was damaged and destroyed. The foundation had saved one of those panels, which is completely charred and black and very fragile. Our goal was to handle the object very carefully and provide safe transportation so that we could get the object into the exhibit without handling the fragile charcoal. And a comprehensive treatment is the most challenging for us because it involves so many different aspects of professional staff members and experts to come into our consideration of how we deal with an object, such as the stairway on loan to us from the Minokin Foundation. How do you put a staircase in a gallery? That was our challenge. We started with a pile of boards, essentially parts of the staircase, and we came up with a section of the staircase that we reconstructed in a conjectural way to hang 20 feet off of the wall in the Penny Court Gallery in the DeWitt Wallace Museum. There were a lot of different aspects of aesthetic reintegration of new parts looking somewhat like the old structure as a whole so that it would be coherent. And then it was working very closely with the museum staff to actually hang the staircase on the wall, which was no easy task. So very complicated, very satisfying treatment. When curators make requests of us for objects to be treated or to be assessed, generally, we like to get the objects here in the lab. It's a lot easier to do the study of the actual physical object and the materials. So that's the first thing is, can we get it here? And then we'll start doing an assessment of the structural stability. Generally, that's the first thing that we start with. Is the object whole? Is it intact? Is it structurally weak? Is it failing? And we'll consider all of those condition issues that might be a part of the long-term solution. Architectural materials are interesting now because the museum has expanded to include galleries dedicated to architectural materials. So now we have the opportunity with the Boswell Karachi Gallery and in the Penny Gallery to actually exhibit these materials in a way that's different. So they're crossing the threshold of the museum, they're going on the pedestal, they're in the glass case now. This is our chance to sort of showcase some of these materials that have formerly been really just for study, and now we can consider them as ornate and decorative objects in some ways.
That was a very informative look into what it takes to care for wooden artifacts. Please post your questions as Chris and Dani are here to answer them for you. Chris, would you tell us about who works with you on the preservation and conservation of these artifacts?
Yes, we're fortunate here at Colonial Williamsburg to have a collection of conservators, a group of conservators in our department, pretty much covering our whole range of media in the collection, including paper and paintings and objects, archaeology, furniture, preventive conservation, analytical science work, and so on. So we don't contract out. We work as a collaborative team very often on many projects to put together our specialty knowledge to conserve some of these collections. So that's the group that I work with is in the wooden artifacts section, and we pretty much take care of the furniture, as I mentioned, and the sculpture and other decorative arts of wood.
All right, thank you. And now let's take a question from our audience. And one viewer would like to know, what is Minokin?
Minokin is an important early 18th century house, historic house in that was owned by Francis Lightfoot Lee and Rebecca Taylor. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, so obvious historical importance. And the house is a rare sandstone construction, which is rare in Virginia. But it's also known somewhat because it has a collection of interior architectural works that have been saved when the house was at risk some decades ago. The architectural interiors were taken out and preserved separately. And they're now housed at the Minokin Foundation. And so we had the privilege of borrowing the staircase from Minokin in order to reconstruct it and reinterpret it in our gallery, hung on the wall. And so that was quite a nice loan exchange from Minokin, and we had the great privilege of putting it together in a conjectural way. So that's what we did from Minokin.
Excellent. Another viewer would like to know whether there are collections like this at other museums.
I mean, you have like house museums that might have bits and pieces from either their one building or their support buildings on the site. I mean, you have it all the way up to the Smithsonian, which has massive collections, but there's not really anything in our sort of range from the 600 plus buildings that we have, and just the vast variety of what we have, again, from something as small as a paint sample, nails, plaster, bricks, wood trim, roofing shingles. I mean, it's literally from ground to roof. And so there's not another one that I would say is exactly like us. There's no really living history museum like ours, the size of ours, and with the amount of buildings and architectural fabric that we have. So there are smaller versions, but there's nothing quite like what we have.
I would imagine because of the size and scope of the collection and the years that it's taken to uncover all of this, that Colonial Williamsburg must be a very valuable resource for other institutions when they have, questions and things they want to compare to.
Well, and that's the purpose of saving and holding on to what we've held on to. It's for that study, it's for the future, it's for today, tomorrow, because we constantly keep learning. And again, as analytical abilities and technologies continue to improve, they can learn even more than what we know. I mean, we can look at a profile and reproduce it, but again, when you come down to what make things up, what paints we use and everything else, it's just going to get better and better and better, our ability to replicate. So it's immensely important for not only for today, but for the future.
All right.
I think the more common experience is to go to historic sites and see the houses themselves. Mm-hmm. And there's an idea to try to put the things back into or back together with a house. And so that tends to be how most people, and including us for the most part, experience and document and study other architectural collections is by actually seeing them in the house. And that's true here as well. But very few other institutions have the wherewithal and the support and the storage facility and the oversight of preservation professionals to take care of an additional collection of fragments. So that's one thing that we have the benefit of.
Oh, thank you. What can these artifacts tell you about their makers?
That's a great question. It often, from a construction standpoint and a material standpoint, we can see the evidence of the training and the sophistication of the knowledge that came into, that was a part of making something, the kind of tooling, the kind of joinery, the kind of materials that were selected and how they were assembled, how they were put together and designed and so on. And so often we can see a reflection of a cultural influence of, let's say, the guild system training in the old world versus maybe more the vernacular, make it up as you go along system that we might see more of in a colonial setting like America. So that's an interesting bit of insight that we have that we often find.
All right, another viewer question is, what has been your most challenging building element to conserve?
I would say probably the staircase from Minokin again, and this is because it's a large object, which is the complexity of moving around a large thing is always more difficult, but also because it was a fragment in the sense that we didn't have all of the parts to the first floor of the staircase. that we borrowed. So we had to recreate some aspects of, for example, the main stringer section, which is the diagonal part that's sort of backbone and holds everything together. We had to come up with that element anew and figure out how to attach the old parts to some of these newer parts in order to make it a whole and read as an integrated whole of a staircase. And then, of course, the challenge of hanging it on a wall 20 feet off of the floor in the museum gallery, was also a fairly big challenge.
I would imagine so. Another question is, how did you keep the burned wood panel from falling apart? The one that was seen in one of the videos.
That's a good question, because it looks as if on the outside that it's burned through and through, but in fact, the stoutness and thickness of the joinery of those members architecturally is quite substantial, and there's quite a lot of solid wood behind the outer charred surface. So this was a panel that was rescued from a house fire, of course, and it wasn't completely burned through, in other words. So we still have the structure to enable us to handle and move around, but we had to be very careful not to touch the front charred surfaces. And we decided through our research and studies that there wasn't a significant history of treatment of charred objects to go in and use a resin or intervene in some way to change that surface. So our approach was just simply to provide a safe means of carrying it around and putting it on exhibit with a very careful mount so that we didn't actually touch the fragile front.
Wow. It adds a whole new meaning to fragile, handle with care.
Yes.
All right. Another question is, who makes the reproduction architectural elements used in Colonial Williamsburg historic buildings?
Well, that's a good question too, and we have the great advantage at Colonial Williamsburg of having the historic trades program here, which we work with very closely on a regular basis. They have great knowledge of these historic structures as well as we do in conservation with our studies of historic objects. And so it might be the conservators who occasionally may make a replica, for example, the Orr House mantle that Dani mentioned. It might also be the historic area carpenters who might make railings or window frames or doors for new construction. So we have the luxury of being able to work with these other professionals and sort of figure out, where the best fit is for making the occasional reproduction thing.
That depth of expertise to have on one staff is
Yes.
probably
It's
something that's
amazing.
very valuable.
Yes.
All right. Well, we're almost out of time, so let's take one more viewer question. And that is, what satisfaction do both of you get in working with the collection?
Well, I just love that I come in every day and my job is in my collection. I go out in the historic area, in the buildings, maintaining the buildings, and just, seeing people like Chris and others in conservation who I know that when we have an issue or when we get to have an exhibit and we want to show burnt pieces, I know it can happen. So it's very exciting. You can kind of imagine anything and doing anything with a collection and showing anything with a collection. And again, just because the expertise that we have here and the colleagues that we have, we're able to bring it to the public, not only when they walk through the historic area, but now when they go into the museum, or if they just even come toward the storage areas. So it's very exciting that it's not just hidden and stored away.
And Chris?
Yeah, it's the idea of bringing what would formerly have been a study collection into the public view. That's very exciting to me, that we have always had these collections in storage and for available to scholars and professionals. But now we get to share some of that with the public, and we'll be able to rotate collections through from time to time as well. And then as well, treating the objects and being able to bring them back in a way through some of our treatments to enable them to be handled and to be shown on exhibit is also very satisfying.
Excellent. Well, before we conclude this program, Dani, please tell us about the exhibition Restoring Williamsburg, which will be opening on Saturday, April 30th in the James Boswell and Chris Caracci Gallery at the Art Museums here in Colonial Williamsburg.
I'm very excited to talk about the exhibit, which is going to open, like you said, April 30th. And it's going to cover everything, again, basically from floor to ceiling. And what it's meant to do is it's meant to take the person who's coming through the museum, through what you will see in the historic area, what roofing types, what door types, windows, and explains kind of why they are there. It gives context to what you see when you go out into the historic area and you're looking at the buildings. When you're walking through the buildings, you can get a feel for, oh yeah, this is 18th century in style, this is 19th century in style. And it's just, it's a great opportunity where we can't always be standing there to explain things. They can look at the exhibit and then go out and understand a little bit better the historic area and our built environment.
It sounds wonderful. Well, Colonial Williamsburg's architectural collection is safeguarded in storage, yet it is still visible in so many places. In the historic Colonial Williamsburg Outdoor Museum, in the Art Museum's exhibitions, via virtual tour, through the online database eMuseum, and on social media channels. Thank you, Dani and Chris, and your colleagues and volunteers in the museum's preservation and historic resources for sharing your enthusiasm about this important work. Video of this program will be available for viewing at colonialwilliamsburg.org, our Facebook page, and our YouTube channel. Colonial Williamsburg relies on the generosity of guests and donors like you. This project was funded in part by a generous grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. We hope you will join us on Friday, May 20th, for the Photographic Collections Exposed live stream. We'll talk about the variety of media collections housed in the John D. Rockefeller Jr. Library. These collections help inform our understanding of early 20th century Williamsburg and document ongoing work at Colonial Williamsburg. They also illustrate current programming and research in the historic town and art museums. And remember, when you are considering history, always consider the sources.